G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we are now in the second last book of the Minor Prophets. We have Zechariah here, and then after him we have Malachi. So tonight we're looking in Zechariah down to chapter 2, verse 5. I've given you an outline there. We won't go through the outline. We'll just cover it briefly in the introduction. Now, as we know, it's got 14 chapters in it. Now, in the introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 to 6, in the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of Jehovah unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying, Jehovah was sore displeased with your fathers. Therefore say unto them, thus says Jehovah of hosts, return unto me, says Jehovah of hosts, and I'll return unto you, says Jehovah of hosts. Be ye not as your fathers, unto whom the former prophets cried, saying, thus says Jehovah of hosts, return you now from your evil ways and from your evil doings. But they did not hear, nor hearken unto me, says Jehovah. Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? But my words and my statutes, which I commanded my servants the prophets, did they not overtake your fathers? And they turned and said, like as Jehovah of hosts thought to do unto us, according to our ways and according to our doings, so hath he dealt with us. This is the first 7 verses of Isaiah, of Zechariah, which we're going to cover in the first 5 verses of chapter 2. Now, Zechariah's theme is the eternal word of God, and it begins in verse 1 by giving us the call of the prophet. The date when he was called, Zechariah's call, is given as the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, or Darius, which makes it around about 520 BC. So he began to be a prophet at the same time as Haggai, but Haggai's prophetic ministry only covered a period of 3 months, as we saw, while Zechariah's prophetic ministry covers the years from 520 until 470 BC. So that's a 50-year period, which is 50 years. Now, on that day, the word of Jehovah came unto Zechariah. Zechariah means Jehovah remembers. As to his family, we're told that he was the son of Berechiah, which means Jehovah blesses. Then he goes back 1 generation further and tells us that Berechiah was the son of Iddo, which means his time. So if we're to put all these 3 names together, what we have here is Jehovah remembers and Jehovah blesses in his time. The background to Zechariah's prophecy has to do with the captivity and the return from Babylon. The purpose of the book of Zechariah is to trace the program of God during the times of the Gentiles. The theme of the book of Daniel is the times of the Gentiles. The theme of the book of Zechariah is Israel during the times of the Gentiles. So the overall basic outline is that he has 8 visions, in chapters 1 to 6. He has 4 messages in chapters 7 to 8 and 2 burdens in chapters 9 to 14. Now, the key phrase throughout this book is Jehovah of hosts, and it occurs in this book a total of 52 times. Its location here is in Jerusalem. And as we said, the theme is the times, Israel during the times of the Gentiles. Now, the historical setting, Ezra mentioned in Ezra chapter 5, verse 1 and chapter 6, verse 14, that both Haggai and Zechariah were prophesying in encouraging the people to rebuild the temple despite the difficulties that faced them. By this time, for the most part, Israel had forsaken idolatry. They were pretty much cured of idolatry in their time in Babylon. It was a time when you had the rise of the synagogue. It was a period when in the land, at least, there had been no prophecy for 70 years. This is in Israel. Although in the exile, we had Ezekiel and Daniel, and both of those men did prophesy. The spiritual conditions were quite poor in the land of Israel. The pre-exile prophets, who included all the minor prophets, minus these three here, all prophesied preceding the exile into Babylon. Now, among the majors, we had Isaiah and Jeremiah. Then there were two exilic prophets, prophets of the exile, and that was Daniel and Ezekiel. Both of them were in Babylon when they prophesied. But here we have three post-exilic prophets. Haggai, who prophesied from the 6th to the 9th month. Then we had Zechariah, who was a priest, according to Nehemiah 12, verse 4 and 16. Iddo, his grandfather, was a priest. So Zechariah was both a priest and a prophet. And he began to prophesy in the 8th month, which means he began about 2 months after Haggai did. And then much later came the last of the prophets, minor or otherwise, and that was Malachi. Now, we'll see that in the book of Zechariah, it's organized along certain thematic revelations. It begins in section 1, where he deals with the 8 visions, beginning from chapter 1, verse 7 to chapter 6, verse 18. And then in chapters 7 and 8, he deals with the question of fasting. And then the rest of section 2 centers around 4 messages. So we have 8 visions followed by 4 messages. And then the rest of the book is 2 burdens, with section 2 comprising the first burden in chapters 9 to 11, and section 4 comprising the second burden in chapters 12 to 14. Now, in the New Testament, we have Zechariah 9:9 quoted in Matthew 21, 4 to 5. We also have Zechariah 11, verse 13 in Matthew 27, verse 9. Zechariah 12:10 in John 19, verse 37. And Zechariah 13:7 we have in Matthew 26, verse 31, and Mark chapter 14, verse 27. Now in verse 2, Zechariah gives a declaration about past history. Jehovah was sore displeased with your fathers. So in verses 3 to 4, he issues a call to repentance. Therefore say you unto them, thus says Jehovah of hosts. So first of all, what we see in verse 3, we have a reciprocal arrangement where God says, return unto me, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will return unto you, says Jehovah of hosts. So you turn back to me and I'll turn to you. If Israel will return to God, then God will return to Israel. And that is the way it's going to be for Israel during the times of the Gentiles. Now, for those of you who don't know, the times of the Gentiles is that long period of time from when we had the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and it will continue right down until the second coming, when Messiah comes to rule. It's a time in Israel's history where Jerusalem particularly is dominated by Gentile powers. So it's a very long period of time. But then God now warns them in verse 4. He says, don't be like your fathers who rejected the prophets. Be you not as your fathers, unto whom the former prophets cried. Now, the former prophets, well, they are the pre-exilic prophets, the ones pre-exile. And those prophets came, and as we see the written word, they called the people continually to repentance. You know, we have examples of this we can find in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 6 to 7, Also Jeremiah 3, verse 12 to 13, Ezekiel 18, 30 to 31, and also Hosea chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. Now, these prophets came declaring that Jehovah of hosts was saying to them, return you now from your evil ways and from your evil doings. However, this verse points out that the prophets were rejected. It says, but they did not hear nor hearken unto me, says Jehovah. So they rejected the prophets, they rejected God. Now, the introductory section ends in verses 5 to 6 with a conflict between God and Israel. And the conflict is in the form of a dialogue here. God speaks in verse 5. He speaks first in the first part of verse 5, and he asks a question. He says, your fathers, where are they? In other words, their fathers were dead in fulfillment of the words of the prophets. Then in the second part of verse 5, the people respond by saying that the prophets did not make it either. And the prophets, do they live forever? The answer is also no. So yes, their fathers died, but so did the prophets. And so everybody ended it the same way. So what difference does it make? This is what they're virtually saying. What difference does it make then? Because they both died. God responds to them now in verse 6, that his words which the prophets spoke were fulfilled. My words and my statutes, which I commanded my servants the prophets, did they not overtake your fathers? So what he's saying is all the threatened judgments did overtake their fathers. So the answer is yes, that the word that came from the prophets did overtake our fathers. Now, furthermore, in the captivity, their fathers had to acknowledge that the word of God had been fulfilled in their lives. In their captivity, when they turned and said, like as Jehovah of hosts thought to do unto us, according to our ways and according to our doings, so hath he dealt with us. So they learned the truth of Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 to 8, that while the grass and the flower may fade, the word of God is going to stand forever. It will stand forever. And now we have the 8 visions, which we're going to look at. The first one, we have the 8 visions in chapter 1, verse 7, down to chapter 6, verse 18. First vision we find in verses 7 to 17. Now, the point of the first vision is that God has a plan for Israel. In fact, we can summarize the first vision before we examine it. First up, the angel of Jehovah is in the midst of a degraded and deprived people, in the midst of Israel. And he makes a loving and yearning intercession for them. And that results in a promise of future blessings. So that's the summary of the first vision. So we have the vision of the horses in verses 7 to 11. So this is verse 7. Upon the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shabbat, in the second year of Darius, came the word of Jehovah unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying, I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding upon a red horse. And he stood among the myrtle trees that were in the bottom, and behind him there were horses, red, sorrel, and white. Then said I, O my Lord, what are these? And the angel that talked with me said unto me, I will show thee what these are. And the man that stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are they whom Jehovah has sent to walk to and fro through the earth. And they answered the angel of Jehovah that stood among the myrtle trees and said, We have walked to and fro through the earth, and behold, all the earth sitteth still and is at rest. So in this first vision here, we begin with the vision of the horses in verses 7 to 11. Verse 7 giving us the date of it. he tells us that it happened in the 24th day of the 11th month, Shivat, which is a Hebrew name for the 11th month. Now, it was in the second year of Darius, or Darius, which was the year 520 BC. And again, it makes it the same year that Haggai, the previous prophet, was also called. It also means here that 3 months have now passed between the call of the prophet in verses 1 to 6, when he begins to see the vision of verse 20. A 3-month period has transpired now. Furthermore, it was at that time that the word of Jehovah came unto Zechariah, the prophet. Again, he's identified by his father, son of Berechiah, and by his grandfather, the son of Iddo. In verse 8, we read about the horses. He introduces us to the fact that he saw a vision. He says, I saw in the night. And this is a common way in which a vision would come to a prophet. And in this vision, he says, behold, a man riding upon a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle trees that were at the bottom. Now, the Hebrew word for bottom, which is metzula, means a shady place. Now, it was located in the bottom of a low, shady place. And this low, shady place is a symbol of the Gentile world. And behind this key rider on the red horse were other horses, which were of 3 different colors. We had a red one, a sorrel one, and a white one. Now, these other horses represent divine agencies in the affairs of government. These are God's angels, which he uses in dealing with affairs of human government. In verse 9, there is a request for the identification. And at that point, Zechariah speaks. Then said I, O my Lord, what are these? And the angel that talked with me said unto me, first, I will show you what these are. Secondly, here, I'll just point out that this is the rider on the red horse, and the angel is speaking to him. And thirdly, we're going to see that the angel of Jehovah, these are all the same person in this context. So the one individual here goes by 3 different identities in these visions. Firstly, we find in verse 8, he's the man riding upon the red horse. And then second, in verse 10, he's the one revealing these things to Zechariah. And thirdly, in verse 11, he's the same as the angel of Jehovah. Now, the angel of Jehovah throughout the Old Testament is the second person of the Godhead. So he's God the Son. And this is one of the pre-incarnate manifestations of the Son. And in verse 10, he gives Zechariah the identification. The man that stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, and what he said was, these are they whom Jehovah has sent to walk to and fro through the earth. So the way that he identifies them, this is the man standing among the myrtle, the way he identifies these other beings shows them to be more than, they're not simply horses or just riders on horses. Rather, these are angelic beings who have a specific mission in this world, especially among the Gentile nations. Notice it says there that they walk to and fro, which is one of the Old Testament ways of describing angelic movement. We see this phrase used of Satan in Job chapter 1, verse 7, and again in chapter 2, where it speaks about Satan. He was going to and fro in the earth. Satan was asked, where have you been? He says, I've been going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it. So that's a term which is used of the angelic beings, celestial beings. In verse 11, these other angelic beings report back to the angel of Jehovah, and they answer the angel of Jehovah that stood among the myrtle trees. We have walked to and fro through the earth. In other words, their mission for which they were sent was accomplished. And now they've come together into this bottom of the low shady place to let them know that the mission has indeed been accomplished. The report of the angel of Jehovah is, all the earth is still and is at rest. The earth being still and at rest, what that means is nothing is moving while Israel seems to still lie desolate. So, it might be good for the nations. I mean, we'd love the earth to be still and at rest today. While it might be good for the nations and everything to be still and at ease, that is not good for Israel, because it means that nothing is moving towards the accomplishment of God's plan for Israel. Nothing is going on. So while that might seem from an initial reading to be a positive report, in actual fact, it is actually a negative report. Things are not moving towards the accomplishment of the plan. So that leads to the promise of mercy to Zion in chapter 1, verses 12 to 17. Remember, everything revolves around Israel. So every world event, we need to look at it in the light of how does this affect Israel? Now, in verses 12 to 17, the promise of mercy. In this second part of the vision here, we have a promise now of mercy and design. It begins in verse 12 with the prayer of the angel of Jehovah. This is a prayer of the Son to the Father. Now, in light of the negative report from the other angels that nothing seemed to be moving towards the accomplishment of the plan for Israel, then the angel of Jehovah speaks up and says, Then the angel of Jehovah answered and said, O Jehovah of hosts, how long wilt thou not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which thou hast had indignation these 70 years? So in other words, the angel of Jehovah is inquiring of God the Father, when will he begin to move to restore Jerusalem to the glory he had promised, now that the city has laid waste for the past 70 years, and this was the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. The world is at peace, but Israel is in degradation. So it might be good for the Gentiles, but it's bad news for the Jews. And it also means that it appears that God's covenant is not being fulfilled. But this statement here shows a specific ministry of the angel of Jehovah, which is to pray for the Jews, to pray for or on behalf of Israel and Jerusalem. Now, there's another bunch of angels which has a similar ministry, and those are the angels that are standing on the walls of Jerusalem, which if you look in Isaiah 62 verses 6 to 7, it points it out there. So God has angels standing upon Jerusalem's walls, and their entire ministry is to be Jehovah's remembrances. They're to keep on reminding him, to keep on, as it were, pestering him until he fulfills his promise of making Jerusalem the praise of the earth. Isaiah 62 says, I have set watchmen upon thy walls, O Jerusalem. They shall never hold their peace day nor night. You that are Jehovah's remembrances, take ye no rest, and give him no rest till he establish and till he make Jerusalem a praise in the earth. So they're the angels on the walls of Jerusalem, continually reminding God of his promises to restore Jerusalem, to make it a praise in the earth. In verse 13, Jehovah answered the angel that talked with me with good words, even comfortable words. So it was a message of comfort with good words and comfortable words. So the angel that talked with me said unto me, Cry thou, saying, Thus says Jehovah of hosts, I am jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with a great jealousy. And I am very sore displeased with the nations that are at ease. For I was but a little displeased, and they helped forward the affliction. So we're going to find 7 declarations in the message that we're going to see as here. I am jealous, and continuing, I am jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with a great jealousy. That's verse 14. Just the first declaration. In verse 15, I am very sore displeased with the Gentiles that are at ease. Again, what he's doing here is he's showing that the angelic message about the Gentiles being at ease was a negative message. It wasn't a good thing, because this is all about Israel. So God is very sore displeased with these Gentile nations who are at ease. In actual fact, the Hebrew translation is much stronger. It says, with great anger, I am angered at these Gentile nations that are at ease. The specific sin of these nations is anti-Semitism, because he says, I was but a little displeased. So God was but a little displeased against Israel, and because of his little displeasure against Israel, he did allow the Gentile nations to attack Israel. But then he adds, but they have helped forward the affliction. That means that while God did want the Gentile nations to punish Israel on his behalf, the Gentile nations went beyond what God had wanted and what God had intended. And so they went further than God wanted to, and because they went too far, they are now going to be punished. Same point is made by Isaiah chapter 10. Back there, while God he wanted Sennacherib and the Assyrians to punish Israel, they went well beyond what God had wanted them to do. And this very point that he just made here about his displeasure against the Gentile nations is going to be elaborated upon by Zechariah's second vision. Third declaration in verse 16 is, I am returned to Jerusalem with mercy. So God intends to fulfill his program. Also in verse 16, my house shall be built in it. So what this is saying is that the Jewish temple will be rebuilt. And while this may have a reference to the second temple, its ultimate viewpoint is really the millennial or messianic temple. This will be elaborated upon in the fifth vision. In verse 16, a line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. Now, this is a symbol for building. So the city will be expanded massively, and this will be developed in the third vision. Then the sixth declaration, my cities shall yet overflow with prosperity. So besides Jerusalem, the cities of Judah are to overflow with prosperity, according to verse 17. Also in verse 17, Jehovah shall yet comfort Zion and shall yet choose Jerusalem. So God intends to make Jerusalem his chosen city, and this will be elaborated upon by the fourth vision. And we come to the second vision, verses 18 to 21. The main point of the second vision is that God is in total control. Now, if we were to summarize the second vision before we actually look at it verse by verse, the second vision here elaborates the point of the first vision found in chapter 1, verse 15, where he says, I am very sore displeased with the nations or the Gentiles that are at ease, for I was but a little displeased, and they helped forward the affliction. So God's punishment of the Gentiles for what they did to the Jews is what we have been elaborated on in this second vision. And secondly, he points out God takes into account everyone who lifts up his hand against the Jews. And thirdly, the vision is going to teach us that God has complete knowledge of the condition of his people. Fourthly, he has already pronounced a punishment for those rising against the Jews. And fifthly, we have here the principle of the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 12, verse 3, where I'll curse them that curse you. So you come against the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and God will come against you. Now we have four horns in verses 18 to 19 of chapter 1. Here we says, verse 18, and I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, four horns. And I said unto the angel that talked with me, what are these? And he answered me, These are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. So in verses 18 to 19, the vision begins here with 4 horns. He says, I lifted up mine eyes and saw. So he introduces here a fact that this is a new vision. And the content is, behold, 4 horns. In verse 19, we have the identification of the 4 horns. It begins with a question raised by Zechariah. Well, what are these? And the answer is given. These are the horns which have scattered Judah and Israel and Jerusalem. In other words, these are representatives of the 4 Gentile empires who have scattered Israel. And this had already been revealed in Daniel's prophecy in chapters 2 and 7. They were, first of all, remember we had the Babylonian Empire, followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the Hellenistic or the Greek Empire, and then the 4th Gentile empire of imperialism that began with the Roman Empire and will finally culminate with the Antichrist. So these are the Gentile nations that will, or empires that will dominate Israel and especially Jerusalem. Now, the picture of the horn of an animal is used throughout the Bible as a symbol of power and pride. So usually it's the pride of the Gentile power. It was these 4 Gentile powers that had scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Now, remember, Judah is the southern kingdom, Israel is the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem is always given a separate status to the north and southern kingdoms. Now, we have 4 smiths in chapter 1, verses 20 to 21. And Jehovah showed me 4 smiths. Then said I, what come these to do? And he spake, saying, these are the horns which scattered Judah, so that no man did lift up his head. But these are come to terrify them, to cast down the horns of the nations, which lifted up their horn against the land of Judah, to scatter it. So after seeing the 4 horns, he sees a vision of the 4 smiths in verse 20. And in verse 21, he receives the identification of these. Again, he raises the question as he sees the vision. He says, what are these guys coming to do? And the answer is, these are the horns which scattered Judah, and so that no man lifted up his head. So again, what we see here is that he summarizes the 4 horns. These horns are the ones guilty of scattering Israel to the point that no man responded in mercy, no man lifted up his head, no one came to help. So what have these 4 smiths come to do? These 4 smiths have come to terrify the 4 horns. So these are the 4 that are sent to punish the 4 horns, to cast down the horns of the nations. Now, these 4 smiths are 4 individual kings or leaders God uses to cast down the 4 Gentile empires. The first smith would be Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now, remember the Medo-Persians destroyed the Babylonians. So that was Cyrus, king of Persia. And then the second would be Alexander the Great, who then brought down the Medo-Persian Empire. So we have Cyrus, we have Alexander the Great. The third was the Roman general Pompey, who finally took away the land of Israel from Hellenistic control and put it under Roman control. Now, the 4th smith will be Jesus Christ himself, because he will destroy the final Gentile ruler of the 4th Gentile empire, who will be the Antichrist. So the reason why these 4 smiths have come, he says, is they lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter it. So because they went beyond what God intended when they scattered Israel, the horns are going to be punished. And once again, we have the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 12, verse 3. Now, the third vision we have in chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. Now, the main point of the third vision is to show that Jerusalem will become the capital city of the Messianic kingdom in the millennial earth. To summarize this vision, This vision here is an elaboration of what was said back in verses 16 to 7 of chapter 1. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, I am returned to Jerusalem with mercies. My house shall be built in it, says Jehovah of hosts, and a line shall be stretched forth over Jerusalem. Cry yet again, saying, thus says Jehovah of hosts, my cities shall yet overflow with prosperity, and Jehovah shall yet comfort Zion, and shall yet choose Jerusalem. So what he said in these words, he now elaborates upon by the third vision. This is verses 1 to 5 here, chapter 2. And I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, whither goest thou? And he said unto me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof, and what is the length thereof. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him, and said unto him, run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, by reason of the multitude of men and cattle therein. For I, saith Jehovah, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and I'll be the glory in the midst of her. So in verses 1 to 5, we have the vision of the man with a measuring line. And in verse 1, we're introduced to a surveyor with a measuring line. He then starts out by saying, I lifted up mine eyes and saw. So what's that mean? It means he now sees a new vision. Zechariah now sees a new vision. The content of this third vision is, behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. The measuring line is a symbol of construction. It's a symbol of building up. The point is, Jerusalem is destined to be built up. Now we see the symbol of the measuring line being used in that way in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 38 to 40. Also Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 3, and Revelation chapter 21, verse 15. So what we see here is Jerusalem is destined to be built up. In verse 2, we see the purpose to measure Jerusalem. So in view of her complete restoration, Zechariah now raises again a question. He says, where do you go? And the answer is to measure Jerusalem, to find out what is the breadth thereof and the length thereof. So from this question now comes the message of verses 3 to 5, beginning in verses 3 and the first part of verse 4 with the angel's command. Behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him. So you have the angel of the Lord approaching Zechariah, and another common angel who we haven't seen before comes forward to meet him. And he said, run, showing urgency, and speak to this young man. The young man is a reference to Zechariah the prophet. So the angel of the Lord tells a common angel to run urgently over to Zechariah and quickly tell him the meaning of the vision, which is in the second part of verse 4. Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls. Now, there'll be two reasons why Jerusalem will be like this. The first reason, it's by reason of the multitude of men and cattle therein, meaning Jerusalem is simply going to be too great in size. With too many people being put within the confines of a walled city, the walls just won't contain the people. Secondly, being without a wall is a symbol of security, according to Ezekiel 38, verse 11. Now, an alternative translation for this verse is, after that I saw the angel who had been speaking with me walk forward from beside me toward another angel who was coming forward to meet me. It's a bit convoluted, but that's what it is. The angel who was speaking with him walked forward from beside him toward another angel who was coming forward to meet him. And then finally in verse 5, he says, Jehovah will be the wall and the glory. So Jehovah is going to be two things to Jerusalem in the Messianic kingdom. Jehovah will be unto her a wall of fire round about. So this shows the manner of her protection. It's by a wall of fire that will be quite visible, and it will burn anyone who tries to touch it as an act of antagonism. And secondly, God will be the glory in the midst of her. So that tells us that the Shekinah glory will be present within the city, which also means that the Messiah will be present in Jerusalem. And because he is the Shekinah glory, he's the visible manifestation of God's presence. Because Messiah will be present in Jerusalem, he'll be the Shekinah glory, because he's the visible manifestation of God's presence. Now, in this verse, there are at least two ways in which the Shekinah glory will be manifested. It will be as a wall of fire surrounding Jerusalem, but also in the person of the Messiah within the city. Now, remember, this will be happening in the Messianic or millennial kingdom. No walls around the city of Jerusalem. Instead, we'll have this wall of fire surrounding it. And that ends our first session for Zechariah. Thank you for coming along. I pray that it would have helped you in some way, and study hard and grow strong.